right. Hello, Christine. Nice to join you on stage to discuss a very important topic, which is data and people, data and culture, right? And people are essentially both from inside internally and externally, as customers externally, but also our team internally. And when we were backstage a little bit and we're talking about and preparing for this panel, we said actually like part of making your job fun is the people that you work with. So, and you shared with me already that you've been basically building up Nylas for the last 9.5 years, so quite a journey. I would love to get to know you a little bit at the beginning and find out a little bit about your path, why you chose to do what you do, and how people, data, and culture play into this.
Cool. Thanks for that quick intro, Elena. And I just also wanted to say that it's amazing to be back at Web Summit with 71,000 people here post-COVID. It's huge. Great crowds, great energy. I love it. To kind of jump back into my background and sort of what brought me to start Nylas and sort of growing the company throughout the years, I like to say that I got into entrepreneurship kind of by accident. I was really into contributing to open source software when I was in high school, which led me to really want to go to university at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US. And there I got really hardcore into sort of contributing to open source software, contributing to Linux. And the only reason I sort of got into the startup world was because some folks that I met through the MIT Computer Club started a company that was commercializing one of their master's thesis. And I started working at that company and eventually decided not to go to grad school, but instead to go work full-time for this startup. So sort of went through the whole startup journey there. And then after the founder sold that company to Oracle, I was starting to think about what I was going to do next. And I really wanted to get back into the startup world, this time with my own company. So that was over a decade ago at this point, and I've spent the last almost a decade building out Nylas, and have obviously learned a lot in the way and hope to share some of that with you guys.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, great story and very inspiring. I mean, being part of the open source community, already contributed to one startup, now Nylas, which Nylas by itself also as a product, what you guys do is making like success stories more easily, like customer journeys and basically communications internally, right? So tell me a little about how data plays to that, right? How do you do that with your product?
Yeah, for sure. So what Nylas does is we make one simple unified API that makes it easy for developers to connect to all of the mailboxes and all of the calendars in the world. So no matter kind of what provider an end user is on, a developer can just build out one Nylas integration and be able to access and help make actionable the data within their mailbox and their email, as well as with calendars. And the reason that this really plays into a lot of trends that we're seeing in the world today. One is that I kind of like to think of the history of software as being one of, essentially, we've added more and more levels of abstraction throughout the years. And so we're constantly kind of inventing new building blocks because it's kind of human nature to kind of push the limits on a thing until it's too complicated for us to be able to work with it anymore. And then you essentially have to think of a new wrapper for the building blocks in order to be able to pull things together in more complex ways by not having to think about what's under the hood. So with Nylas, we do that with access to email, access with calendar, communications, and how people are using that data is they are trying to make workflows actionable in productivity tools, and they're also trying to use that data in the mailbox, the actions, what people are talking to each other about, to personalize the experiences that people are having on the apps. And I think everybody's trying to build more personalized apps today, and it's all about the data when it comes to that.
It's all about the data in general. I mean, and I like how you're thinking about analogies when it comes to like even describing how software works and why exactly, like how exactly are we using it. And I think like we pretty much always through the centuries have tried to simplify our lives by creating structures and processes. Society is essentially let's say, like the infrastructure as well. It's like a hardware, not the software. And you have like different systems, right, to kind of replicate that. So going back to our topic, though, when it comes to data and culture, and by the way, like I'm always very fascinated to talk about this as well, because my way into this is as having a media platform where we are writing a lot about everything that has to do with data science, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and realizing again and again that the biggest challenge that people have, data scientists, chief data scientists, chief technical officers, is how to hire people and retain them, right? And like when you're making your values, when you're trying to figure out how to structure your company, I mean, that's how you also come from within to outwards, and that's how you also work with your customers. So maybe tell me a little bit about your team. Like, how do you, for example, at Nylas, are taking those data sets, are taking those data points, and essentially assessing your own values internally, and how do you work with customers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So the reason I wanted to talk about both culture and data in this conversation is because they're both really important in the modern world in how a team makes decisions. And I always think about culture as being kind of like the sum total of all of the actions taken every day by all the people on your team. It's not about what you're saying, it's about what you're doing. And it can be helpful to write those values and what you're striving to and aspiring to down to kind of share with the team and sort of strive towards the culture that you want. But at the end of the day, it's like what is the team doing? Like, how are people making decisions? How are people voicing disagreements? Do they, have direct conversations when they disagree, or do they, sort of just sit on it forever and then explode at some point in the future? Things like that. And decision making is really important when you're building a startup. Like, as fast as you can make decisions, that's going to be what drives your business towards success, because startups are sort of a process of iteration and experimentation. You have to try a thing, you have to see the results, and then you have to decide what to do based on those results. I think about it a little bit like the scientific method. The data is kind of the hard information that's informing the decisions, and the culture piece is like the hypothesis in the scientific method. You have to have a story and a thesis to what you're trying to do, and then use the data to prove or disprove and gauge whether you're going in the right direction, or whether what you're trying to accomplish is actually true or not. So it might be helpful to kind of give a bit of an example. One thing is like, if you're building out your product and you want to build the best product out there, things that you might choose to measure are things like your product usage. For us, like, we measure how long it takes people to integrate with our product. That kind of time to integration is a really important thing. And then we can go and say, like, we have an initiative that's like, I want people to be able to integrate with the Nylas platform in 1 day to get to a POC. Maybe that doesn't involve everything that it will take to get all the way up to production, which might involve a lot of sort of backroom stuff on the customer side, approvals, deployment, that kind of stuff. But to get to a POC, it should take 1 day. So for us, the way to measure that is, we came up with a thesis about how do we get people to that goal and why is it important. And then, once we're on that path, we can measure, are we tracking to that, or are we off track? So that's just one example of sort of using data to inform decision making. And one thing I try not to sort of inculcate on my team is we're not data driven, we're data informed. You never want to be in a position where you're just sort of gathering data and trying to use that as like the primary way that you're sort of deciding what to do or making decisions, because data is really lossy. It can't tell you the whole story about like why a feature that you built and shipped is being successful or not. You have to have a human level of interpretation on top of that data in order to figure out why something is happening. And the data is just a tool that can kind of inform, at the end of the day, sort of what are the takeaways for your company and your business that are relevant to driving your business towards success. So you got to start with sort of questions first, and then go down to how can I measure how well these decisions are doing, and am I on track, or is the data telling me that something is completely different? I think you can ask questions and sort of like, as an engineer, as someone with an engineering background, I sort of think of it like debugging a computer program where sometimes the data and the signals you can be getting from things like product usage or what actions people are taking can be a little weird. And they might be surprising. So if you kind of like pull on those threads and ask questions and maybe sort of find different ways of getting information from your users, you can discover interesting things that you might not have predicted.
That's a very good point, and I think like company and culture and data can work complementary to a company, whether that is internally to inform your decisions of how to, as you mentioned, like when you have different characters, different personalities working together, like how exactly would these people would react with each other, who to hire, right? Like what kind of people would fit best in your team based on your values, and then essentially taking that culture and implementing it when it comes to how you deal with your customers and your users, like how exactly do you interact with them. And I do really like this differentiation between data-driven and data-informed, because that somehow combines those two. Because when it comes to data-driven, you sort of assume that everything needs to be dictated by the data, but it's not true. Like the data is sort of there to test your hypothesis. It's sort of there to sort of like, after you decide on your own story, as you said, after you have your own like, your own core values, how you want to lead internally and externally, then essentially the data is there to correct or to change course or to pivot depending on how things are mapping out, right?
Yeah. I think if you start with the data first, you can get into sort of like an unintelligent place as a company where your team ends up just trying to optimize a number, and that's not what you're trying to do as a business. You're not trying to optimize a number. You're trying to generate outcomes for the business. So you have to start with that. What outcomes am I trying to achieve first? And then the data is a tool to measure, are you tracking to achieving that outcome?
Exactly. Yeah, very good point. And I mean, so from your perspective, what was the biggest change that you've seen when you implemented this? And was it always that way that you worked? Was it always like data and culture together, or how did you come up to this conclusion?
Yeah, for sure. I think that obviously there's been a lot of lessons learned throughout the years at Nylas, and I think we've definitely gone back and forth. It can be a little bit like a Goldilocks, too hot, too cold, like we're being too data-driven versus being data-informed. And one of your jobs as a founder is to sort of keep a pulse on what's happening in the culture, and if it's going in the wrong direction, to intervene and to make changes so that the team can be the most effective. So. I think there's times where we've gotten into that mode that is not very smart, over-optimizing towards the data. There's times when we pulled back. There's been times when we've not had the data, and we should have had the data. And I really view it as it's a little bit part art, part science, and have to just gauge where you're at any given time and make adjustments and corrections
accordingly. I see. And when it comes to the customers and the users that you worked with, what have you seen? What was the most fascinating use case that you've seen where you worked like this, where culture, like data was informed by culture, and it was data informed versus data driven? What was a good use case that you've been part of to work closely with a customer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest sort of thing that stands out to me is just how we've kind of optimized the product over time. Things like onboarding, things like which APIs are being kind of the most successful, like where is most of the usage. Like people use our APIs a lot to send messages directly from a user, and so we saw that that was something that was a really key part of the platform, and decided to invest more resources into making that really reliable, making that really work well at scale. And then I think also just sort of how we've worked with our customers. We're in an interesting space where we're kind of B2B to B or B2B to C. So we're working with a business that then either has businesses as customers or end consumers as customers. And so we need to give our customers the tools that they need to be successful with their customers as well. And so figuring out kind of what sort of telemetry data and sort of information about what's going on under the hood we can share with those developers, and then when we're working with enterprise clients that we have partnerships with, what kind of reporting can we generate to make sure that they are well informed, they are able to make decisions within their organizations about how their Nylas powered piece of whatever app that they're building is doing. I think it adds kind of an interesting sort of meta level of challenge on we need to not only be data informed ourselves and drive good decision making ourselves, but how do we do that for our customer base? And it's been really interesting.
Cool, nice. And which kind of people do you think need to be involved in this process when it comes to actually taking this action? Would it be internally someone from the tech team, because you mentioned you mainly work with developers, or would it be also potentially people in organizations, the ones who deal with human resources and with more of the soft skills side of things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think product management is a really important function. Like a lot of startups, we kind of went through the journey where our team was just engineers, and engineers were making all the decisions, talking to customers directly. And now that we're 200 plus people, we have over 1,000 customers. That was just a situation that wasn't scaling. So we really kind of doubled down on having product management as being a really important function that's defining those questions, defining the why, and then really spending their time on kind of that sort of make a thesis kind of thing, so that we don't fall into the two pitfalls I would say are making decisions and then not measuring whether or not you got the outcome that you wanted to, or skipping the thesis part and then just sort of making decisions based off of data, or collecting data with no specific purpose. You can get into this pitfall where you just collect all sorts of different data but don't really have a good idea as to what you're going to use it for. And honestly, that just ends up wasting a lot of time for your organization, because data is expensive to collect. You have all this data sitting around, and you're like, oh, we're going to make really smart decisions because we have all this data. But if you're not asking smart questions and sort of forming smart theses about what you want to get out of it, the data's not useful. It's just sort of pointless cost.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking, actually, that it's not only about the quantity of data, but it's actually, as you mentioned, to summarize, asking the right questions, having a hypothesis, a thesis in the beginning, to sort of measure those right questions and answers, and then not just have data, but have the right kind of data, have smart data. So thank you so much for the discussion.